As I look out, there's quite a lot of new faces, and want to welcome all of you who are here for the very first time, visiting, and been here for a long, long time. As you know, back in December, if you've been following us, since December, Pastor Dave's been preparing us for our journey through the book of Luke. Back in December, we began with some of the Old Testament passages which prelude to the coming of the written words by Luke. As of January, we began the study of the book of Luke, worked through the book of the chapter 1, and this morning, we get to open our Bibles to chapter 2. So I invite you to open your Bibles, if you brought them, to chapter 2, verse 41, and we'll be looking through 41 to 52. But before we start reading, just wanted to say, there are two firsts from this passage this morning. This text is the first time and only time that we get a glimpse into Jesus' childhood. It details a trip to Jerusalem, Joseph and Mary's troubled search for their son. As they find Jesus in the middle of the temple, among the teachers, we will hear of the first recorded words spoken by Jesus in the book of Luke. So there are two firsts that we get to explore this morning. So this significant story sets the tone for the rest of what follows in Luke's gospel and gives us a unique glimpse into Jesus' growth and development as a child growing and maturing in manhood. So let's begin with chapter 2, verses 41 through 52. Every year, Jesus' parents went to Jerusalem for the festival of the Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the festival, according to the custom. After the festival was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem. But they were unaware of it, thinking he was in their company. They traveled on for a day. Then they began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." "Why were you searching for me?" he asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. But his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. In these opening chapters of Luke, Joseph and Mary are portrayed as especially devout and righteous. They observe the rituals and devotional practices of their people. In chapter 2, Joseph and Mary had just named his baby boy Jesus and had him circumcised. In Luke chapter 2, 22-24, I don't have a slide for this. When the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord, and to offer a sacrifice in keeping with with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. In verses 39 to 40, when Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. See, all of these accounts, penned by Luke, are evidences that Joseph and Mary took seriously the demand and requirements of their faith, that which was written in the Torah. Here, I just want to pause for a moment and look at what the expectation that is of a Jew for Passover. Okay, so we can find in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 1 through 8. Observe the month of Aviv and celebrate the Passover of the Lord your God, because in the month of Aviv, he brought you out of Egypt by night. Sacrifice as a Passover to the Lord your God an animal from your flock or herd at the place the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. Do not eat it with bread made with yeast, but for 7 days eat unleavened bread, the bread of affliction, because you left Egypt in haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the time of your departure from Egypt. Let no yeast be found in your possessions in all your land for 7 days. Do not let any of the meat you sacrifice on the evening of the first day remain until morning. You must not sacrifice the Passover in any town the Lord your God gives you except in the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. There you must sacrifice the Passover in the evening when the sun goes down on the anniversary of your departure from Egypt. Roast it and eat it at the place of the Lord your God will choose. Then in the morning return to your tents. For 6 days eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day hold an assembly to the Lord your God and do no work. Luke tells us that Joseph and Mary traveled and made pilgrimage to the Passover festival in Jerusalem every single year. This emphasis on their participation is repeated in the next sentence, and Joseph and Mary are said to observe the custom of the feast. With great emphasis on the family's religious devotion, Luke is saying that Jesus' family's life was oriented from the early going toward the purposes of God, and that the Jewish boy Jesus grew up in a thoroughly Jewish world. Yet, in verse 43, Jesus is also acting independently. Jesus' parents were on their way home, but he stayed in Jerusalem. Jesus' parents assume that he is with the company of folks heading back north. Yet without informing them, Jesus has apparently slipped away and stayed in the city. There is a saying, traveling alone in unfamiliar territory, places, are not advisable. Here I'd like to just pause and tell you a little story about this 20-some-year-old boy that soon had to grow up quickly in a matter of time. So this story took place in Birmingham, not Alabama, but Birmingham, England. So about 11 years ago, I was that boy, and not so young, I guess, 20-some-year-old. So I had the privilege to be a participant of this conference that's held every 5 years called the Baptist World Alliance Centenary Congress that happened in 2005. So I got to mingle with all the other Baptists from all kinds of tradition in Birmingham, England. Now, that was the first time I traveled to England and to Birmingham, of course. And so that very first night that I arrived was the eve prior to the beginning of the conference. And so I decided to go explore. Now, any of you in the room like to explore cities by walking? Yes, okay. Okay? So, there is an aspect of courage that kind of needs to happen for one to go explore by walking in an unfamiliar territory, place, correct? So, I was one kind of like that, and so I went to explore the city center at night and by myself, and soon, I saw a red telephone booth, the traditional telephone booth that you see all around England, and the booth that you see in the picture in the backdrop. So I went, and actually that is the exact booth. So I even had a picture of 11 years ago. And so I decided to call my now wife, but back then my girlfriend, Joanne. So long distance, back to LA. So I made a phone call, international call from that telephone booth, and soon in our conversation, a lot of rowdy people decided to mingle outside of the booth. And without my realization, as I was talking to Joanne, one of the guy that was being rowdy around the booth decided to try to open up the booth door. Okay, now you understand that that booth is quite small. Superman can fit into it, but and I can fit into it, but that's about it, right? So try to fit in more than one adult is quite tight and uncomfortable in terms of spacing. So, but this guy decided to force open, and as he opens, and I'm kind of trying to hold on to the door. Now, there's one caveat to this whole scenario because, I don't know if you realize, but those booth doors actually open outwardly. Now, inside, there's actually no handlebar that I can hold on to so that I can keep it closed. So it's open out and push to go out, right? So, oh well, this guy came in and, I'm kind of like back facing him and with the telephone right here, and then I'm still kind of in this position. And then all of a sudden I felt a little thing behind my back. Now guess what that was? I have no idea, actually, to this day. But there was something that was pinching my back, and maybe it was a gun, maybe it was just a pencil, but I don't know. And all of a sudden, this guy decided to ask me, demand for money. I had some money, not enough pounds, so I decided cleverly to offer all my coins in pounds. And there's a whole lot of pound coins that it feels like a lot, but it's not much. So I decided to just dump it all in his hand, and I said, that's all I got. And thank the Lord. After that conversation, he backed out. And he quickly got onto the car that he came driving up the hill and left. This story should tell us about something. This story should tell you that it's not a good idea to travel alone, especially at night, in a place that you're not familiar with. So if I had known and had access to Lonely Planet, the Traveler's Guide, I would have looked up Birmingham, England, and then this is what it would say. As in most large cities, it's wise to avoid walking alone late at night in unlit areas. And as in most British cities, the center, which I went to, especially south of the Bullring, can be rowdy with revelers on weekend nights. That was exactly my scenario. If I had known, I probably wouldn't have gone out by myself. So you see, independent travel back in Joseph and Mary's days were just as dangerous, if not more. And people often traveled in groups, usually with relatives and with other families. The entourage in this particular company included both relatives, and friends, which could mean a fairly large crowd. I want you to take a look at a map of Israel of that time in the New Testament days. I want you to find where Nazareth is. You find them? You find Nazareth? Southwest corner of Sea of Galilee, right? And they're tiny, I know. But right there, right? And so our text this morning states that the pilgrimage took Mary and Joseph and Jesus from where? Nazareth to where? Jerusalem. Way down there. Ooh, that's high tech. Jerusalem, right? And do you know how far that is? Via Jericho, it's 97 miles. Through Samaria, it's 75. Back then, each day you probably can walk about 20 miles to the day. I did some research out of Christianity Today magazine back in 1998. There was an article written for a descriptive of what it was like to be one who was on a pilgrimage in those days. The first description of promised land given to Moses captures the essence of Palestine's geography. See, listen to this. The land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. Palestine itself was only the size of modern New Jersey. But its dramatic changes in elevation were only one of the countless perils for travelers. The least expensive mode of transportation was, of course, walking. Walking speed depended on the climate, season, and terrain, but one could generally walk for about 20 miles to the day. Along their way, travelers risked dangers and hardships. Attacks by wild beasts remained a threat even until the 19th century, particularly along the Jordan Valley. Worse than the lions, which were eradicated from Palestine during the 1800s, were the unpredictable Syrian bears in the hills. Far more likely were attacks by bandits along lonely stretches. So that should paint a picture for us of what it was probably like if one were to travel alone. Highly not advisable. There's a picture of what a modern day pilgrimage looks like. This is a pilgrimage of the Samaritans traveling for Passover at the Mount of Gerizim. When Joseph and Mary realized that Jesus was missing, they searched high and low within the company, then returned to Jerusalem by themselves. This also meant that if and when they do find Jesus, they will be traveling back north to Nazareth by themselves. A dangerous and risky task at hand. It's fair to say, in time, you'll always find what you're looking for. Even if you're like Joseph and Mary, looking for their preteen son on their road trip home from the Passover festival in Jerusalem. Joseph and Mary and Jesus joined other travelers on their annual pilgrimage. At the end of the festival, they begin their trek home. Joseph and Mary assume Jesus, like any other preteen, avoiding his parents and traveling with other friends or relatives. But after 3 days of searching for their 12-year-old son, Joseph and Mary find him back in Jerusalem talking with the teachers in the temple. Twice, Joseph and Mary are said to be looking for Jesus. This puts Jesus' parents, Joseph and Mary, in the same position as the rest of us. We, too, are looking and look for Jesus, don't we? Some of us have been searching for Jesus. Maybe you're here this morning in hopes that you might find him. Others of us may have found Jesus, but have forgotten what having Jesus is to be about. Searching for Jesus and finding Jesus are faith journeys. This journey continues once we have encountered the living Jesus. This journey of faith, this looking for Jesus, is a work in progress. Later in the book of Luke chapter 6, a great number of people also seek Jesus, desiring to hear and to be healed. Later in the book of Luke chapter 11, Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened." Later in the book of Luke chapter 12, Jesus says, "But seek his kingdom, and these things will be given to you as well." Joseph and Mary eventually found Jesus sitting among the teachers in the temple. At this point, after looking for him for 3 days, Joseph and Mary finally find Jesus when his parents saw him. The text says they were literally struck, astonished. Were Joseph and Mary astonished by witnessing their 12-year-old son, Jesus, fully engaged in listening to them and asking them questions? And or amazed at his understanding and his answers, dialoguing with these teachers? Were Joseph and Mary astonished by realizing that their 12-year-old son, Jesus, was safe and sound in God's house? We don't know exactly, but what we do know from the text is that Mary said to Jesus, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." Here, for the third time, Joseph and Mary are said to be looking, but this time they do so in an anxious, searching kind of way. In the context of the traditional Middle Eastern family of the time, which value loyalty and solidarity above all else, Jesus has shown disrespect to the family by going off on his own. See, this cultural tradition is very similar to that of which we find here in Taiwan, in Asia. Specifically Taiwanese families, we too value loyalty and solidarity in faith and in practice, don't we? The next time you get a chance, ask your neighbors about their faith and belief, and you'll most likely hear of a response along the line of, "Oh, I really don't have any specific faith or belief, but my family members are strict adherers to Buddhism, Taoism, or even ancestor worship." You might not even need to ask your neighbors. Some of us know firsthand what it's like to be living for Jesus in a household where we fear our beloved family members finding out that we don't share the same faith and belief as they do. Some of us face remarks of ridicule and shame on a daily basis because we don't share the same faith. Now, this phenomenon isn't abstained from Christian families. How I wish and hope that Grace Church Taipei, that all of us as a faith village, we are united, we are engaged, we are invested, we sacrifice. For the sake of our children, pray and make way for them to grow in faith and in practice, seeking and having their own personal relationship and encounters with the living Jesus. Our world is changing. Are we oblivious to the happenings around us? The Christ-like faith, traditions, and values we once privileged to have had intertwined into the fabric of our government, society, and everyday life are now slowly but surely being swept away into the margins. Maybe this Christ-like faith, traditions, and values was never meant to be privileged in a world that despises Jesus Christ. Maybe for all this time we've been and have become way too comfortable with the normalcy of Christ-like faith, traditions, and values being the foundation to our society. We've jeopardized the integrity and the dependence that we have of Jesus in our Christian faith. Mary puts Jesus in his place, but Jesus responds, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" These are the first words spoken by Jesus in the book of Luke. These are the first words. Why were Joseph and Mary searching for him? As his parents, they were understandably very worried. Wouldn't you be? Those parents out there, or siblings that you got a responsibility to watch over your brother or sister, that all of a sudden they are gone. It is also understandably that Joseph and Mary fear that they may have lost their son, maybe even to human trafficking. In other words, Joseph and Mary thought Jesus was the one who was lost. Later in the book of Luke, Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." So who's lost? Jesus? Joseph and Mary? Or you and I? This is what Joel Green in his commentary, The Gospel of Luke, calls as one of the primary issues of this text. Who is Jesus' father? To whom does Jesus owe primary allegiance to? Joseph and Mary did not understand what Jesus was saying to them. Yet it is clear that a radical change has taken place. Jesus has elevated himself from the relationship he has with his earthly father, Joseph, and aligned himself with the purposes of his heavenly Father, God. That point being made, then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. Jesus is again portrayed as being loyal to his family, but not until after having established that his true allegiance is to God, which supersedes even the allegiance given to his family. The story completes the early identification of Jesus in Luke's gospel. Gabriel, the angel, had told Mary that her child would be the Holy One and would be the Son of God. Now, in this passage, Jesus is identified as God's Son. In verse 51 and 52, but his mother treasured all these things in her heart. And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. These verses forms a wrap with verse 40. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. The summary, verse 40, refers to the years between Jesus' birth in this passage. The summary in verses 51 and 52 refers to the years from this passage onward to the next time we see in the book of Luke where John the Baptist encountered Jesus and Jesus asks him to baptize him and begin his public ministry. In each case, Jesus grew in wisdom, and in each case, the grace of God was on him. See, I don't know about you, but I've, for a long, long time, been very intrigued by this story. Aren't you? It's like the first story of God's Son Jesus' childhood. Don't you ever wonder, what kind of Jesus was he? What kind of child Jesus was he? What did he know, and when did he know it? Because he's God, right? Did he think of himself as special or different? This passage raises all kinds of questions about Jesus in his own sense of identity. From this little piece of story offered by Luke, at the very least, Jesus seems rather precocious and wise beyond his years. He seems to have been especially sensitive to spiritual things. There's another set of questions that emerge, and those questions have to do with the task of parenting a child like this. It's possible that he was not the easiest child to raise. Maybe he asked lots of questions, especially religious ones. Again, all we can do is speculate. For those who emphasize the divinity of Jesus, what does it mean for Jesus to grow in wisdom? When Jesus answered his parents, he didn't apologize, but responded to their question with two of his own. Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Jesus' questions for his parents, at least on the surface, sounded rather insolent. This isn't the kind of response that would ingratiate me with my parents. I want to get back to the statement, which I believe stands at the heart of this passage. But before we do that, there are two important things to note. First, Jesus' parents don't understand his questions. They're mystified by what he's saying, confused. The second is that Jesus returned home with his parents and was obedient to them. In other words, from that point on, Jesus observed, and was living out like one which was expected of a child in first century Judaism. He obeyed, he honored his parents, as was required by him in the Torah. So back to Jesus' original response. Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house? In other translations, be about my Father's business? What did Jesus mean by this? Do you know? Do you? Jesus seems confused by his parents' anxiety and failure to understand, and to understand that where he would be. It's not just that Jesus was in his Father's house, but that he was in the temple doing his Father's business. In the book of Luke, Jesus has identified himself not with the temple as a place of learning, but he was doing the work to which his Father, that is God, had called him to. In making this statement, Jesus separates himself from his human father and identifies himself with his heavenly Father, God. In this moment, Luke gives us another reminder that Jesus is fully human. But there is more here than meets the eyes. From the time of the visitation of the angel with Mary, to the birth story, and then to the encounter at the temple, at the time of his circumcision, all serve as partial revelations of Jesus' special mission. Here is about one more sign. Ultimately, I believe these words of Jesus saying, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" ought to shake us up and beg us to ask Jesus, "What do you mean? I don't quite understand." Going back to the heart of this passage, the dialogue between Mary and Jesus, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house?" What I hear is a mother saying to her child, "Where have you been, young man? Your father and I didn't survive angel visits, birth in a manger, running away from King Herod, and living like refugees in Egypt, only to have you get lost in Jerusalem." But Jesus isn't the one who is lost, is he? Jesus knows who he is and where he belongs. Joseph and Mary are the ones who are lost, isn't it? Jesus is clear about his purpose and mission in life. Jesus' purpose and mission in life is to fulfill his heavenly Father's desires. As disciples of Jesus, you and I, followers of Christ, are we very clear as to our purpose and mission in life? Jesus' response back to Mary is not only a question, but also a statement to both his earthly parents and to us today. Have you and I placed, intentionally or unintentionally, everything else before our pursuit of God and for his kingdom purposes? Have I placed my family before God? Have I placed my spouse before God? Have I placed my children before God? Have I placed my singleness and desire for intimacy before God? Have I placed my career before God? Have I placed my education and all the accolades before God?